When I imagine my 16-year-old self hearing this next topic about throwing out alphanumeric grades, I would have been very, very excited. If my same 16-year-old self had read the paper that Amanda wrote and what she suggests, I would not have been excited. What she is going to suggest is something far more rigorous and holistic than an A through F grading system. What she's going to wrestle with today is what every teacher in this room has wrestled with. How do we assess student progress? How do we assess student growth? How do we keep track of that? How do we make it authentic? Amanda has done an amazing job this year in exploring this topic. She has thought deeply about it. She's thought of every possible objection that we could hear about this. And in the process, I've become a better teacher. I have considered my own classroom and the way I grade have been called into question. And it's been a wonderful experience for, I hope, both of us. Let me introduce her panel. First, we have Katie Monwai. She is the assistant headmaster at Great Hearts. We have Marcus Foster. He's our languages department chair here at CCS. And we have Hallie Williams, our director of student support here at CCS. Amanda, let me pray for you. Father, thank you for Amanda Hoshauer. Thank you for her diligence. Thank you for her wisdom at such a young age. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to work with her, to walk with her, to listen and to learn from her. Father, we praise you for this time coming to the culmination of all of her work, and I ask that you give her courage and give her patience and give her wisdom as she continues to speak and think and move on from here to CCS into all the endeavors that you will lead her to. We thank you for her and we praise you. Amen.
Good morning. I want you all to imagine a young girl who is overjoyed to begin her educational journey at a Christian classical school. Say her name is Susan. Susan goes through kindergarten, first and second grade with this constant joy. She's excited to learn new things, to meet her new teachers, to meet her new classmates and friends, and play at recess with those new friends. And then Susan hits about third grade. And in third grade, she receives a number on a report card that she is not accustomed to receiving. It is at this point that Susan realizes that these letters and numbers reflected on a piece of paper hold more value than most people let on. She realizes that her identity is being defined by everyone around her simply by a number on a piece of paper, be that her peers, her teachers, her parents, or even herself. Susan is now a senior in high school. She's about to go off into the real world and leave the bubble that has been her Christian classical education. Except she doesn't feel prepared. She feels as if the focus of her education up until this point has been on letters and numbers reflected on a piece of paper, as opposed to intellectual or spiritual growth. It is for this reason that today I will be arguing that alphanumeric grades alone are insufficient for well-rounded student feedback within Christian classical education, and that instead we should have a more holistic approach to evaluating student academic progress and development, as well as the alphanumeric grades. Jerome Bruner, an American psychologist who wrote the book, The Process of Education, says that education should serve as a means to train well-balanced citizens for a democracy. However, this general definition of education is different from that of Christian classical education, which is where I will focus my argument on today. The biggest difference being that Christian classical education teaches for wisdom and virtue rather than mere vocation. This alters the focus to who we become and not simply what we know. Littlejohn and Evans, the authors of Wisdom and Eloquence, said, "We seek to lead citizens on earth to citizenship in heaven while instilling in them the strong desire to create truly virtuous people. In the same way, Covenant makes their aim for education clear, as to say that their sights are set on long-range goals that are not accomplished in a day, a year, or even at graduation. It is sometimes messy, complicated, meandering work, and only the Holy Spirit can truly accomplish what we are aiming for. Students who grow up to glorify God with their lives. In order to understand why alphanumeric grades ultimately fall short, we must first understand what alphanumeric grades even are. Alphanumeric grades are letters and numbers that are used to assess a student's academic progress and development within designated intervals throughout the school year. However, the implementation of these alphanumeric grades within modern Christian classical education has ultimately put students into boxes where they are all held to the same requirements and expectations. Kathy Vatterott, the author of Rethinking Grading, points us to the Industrial Revolution to see an example of this. She says that throughout the industrial time period, students were being educated to beat the time clock and meet deadlines. However, students today are being educated to solve problems and take initiative. While education did used to focus on beating the time clock and meeting deadlines, the world has changed so much today since the Industrial Revolution that we cannot possibly hold our students to the same expectations that we did when students were solely being educated to work in factories. This is why the implementation of a holistic evaluation is ultimately our best option for well-rounded student feedback. Holistic is the idea of looking at the whole student and their overall academic improvement and development, as opposed to just how well a student tests and what their grades reflect. The idea of an evaluation is to assess how much a student has progressed within their academic endeavors. So a holistic evaluation should be put in place to set aside the boxes that every student is put into, where they are all held to the same requirements and expectations, and instead have growth in the forefront of one's mind when educating children. Dorothy Sayers says that in order to produce a society of educated people, we must first turn back the time clock some 400 or 500 years to the end of the Middle Ages, because that is where we first started losing sight of the tools of learning. Because of this, I want us to look at what education looked like during the classical and medieval time periods. During the classical time period, education was most commonly approached as a master-apprentice relationship. A great example of this is Socrates and Plato. Andy Holmes, when discussing the greatest mentor relationships of all time, uses Socrates and Plato as an example of this. He says that mentorship does not always take on the idea of direct teaching, but it can also look like inspiration. And we see this in the relationship between Socrates and Plato. Plato was truly inspired by his teacher, Socrates. We see this in that he wrote multiple books about his teacher, as well as how he followed in his teacher's footsteps. Plato himself became a renowned philosopher and taught Aristotle. He himself became a teacher just like his teacher. During the medieval time period, while education was not always directly approached as a master-apprentice relationship, there were still a very limited amount of people gaining an education. At this time, more often than not, only males were able to gain an education. And even at that, only noble or wealthy males were able to gain an education. Because of this very limited amount of people being educated, it was easy for these students to work in close proximity with their teachers. So we see that in both the classical and medieval time periods, working closely with teachers truly benefited these students and gave them the best possible education. I want us to look at a few ways that alphanumeric grades fall short. The first of these is that alphanumeric grades have implemented a one-shot learning system into education today. What do I mean by this? This is the idea that alphanumeric grades have required a certain amount of grades to be put into the gradebook within a certain period of time. This has often caused teachers to assess students on material before those students are prepared to be responsible for that material. This has caused students to rely on their short-term memory and ultimately just cram. The student goes home the night before the test. They cram as much information as they can into their head for the sole purpose of being able to walk into class the next day, spit as much information as they can onto that piece of paper, except they've relied on their short-term memory. So at the end of the day, how much has that student actually learned or grown at all? They end up forgetting most of what they crammed into their head the night before. Additionally, alphanumeric grades have implemented a rewards and punishment system into education today. Receiving an A has become the end-all, be-all of education. The only part of education that students actually care about. Receiving an A is your reward. You get cheaper car insurance and better college scholarships. However, your punishment is not receiving those good grades. Is those rewards getting ripped from you simply because you didn't get an A on a piece of paper. Alphanumeric grades are also simply unreliable for what we are relying on them for. I'll give you an example. If a student gets an 80% on a test, what that grade is telling that student and their parents is that that student did not understand 20% of that material. However, that's simply not always the case. What if they take a long time to take tests and didn't get to finish their test? Or they have bad test-taking anxiety? What if they didn't participate well in class and that reflected in their grade? What if they forgot to put their name on their piece of paper and their teacher took 20 points off? Or they turned in their assignment 2 days late for 10% off per days? Or maybe they really didn't understand 20% of the material or any mixture thereof. There are so many factors playing a part into these grades that we cannot rely on them to tell us how much a student actually understands. When that student grows up and they're in high school, their grades get sent to a college, that college is being told that that student does not understand 20% of the material, when in reality, they don't know that. And that's not always the case. This is why I believe a holistic evaluation, such as goal setting through teacher-led coaching, is the best alternative to evaluating a student's academic progress and development. Implementing goal setting through teacher-led coaching helps us implement into school what we saw helped students during the classical and medieval time periods. Working closely with those teachers benefited the students in the long run. It gave them the best possible education. So why can't we give that to students today? Why can't we implement a system that allows them to work closely with their teachers? Being able to sit down with a teacher and for that teacher and student to talk about what that student's strengths and weaknesses are. The idea of this system is to move the student's mindset from what does the letter and number say on the top of a piece of paper, and instead move them towards looking at how can I grow? How could I create better study habits, take better notes in class, participate better in class? Having the mentality of the student focus on growth and learning and not letters and numbers. However, the biggest pushback I've gotten from this idea is the issue of time. I fully recognize and acknowledge that time is an issue. I think we can all admit that time is a monster that has held everybody back in all facets of life at one point or another. And it is something that will always be an issue. However, let's not let time get in the way of giving students the best possible education. I want to remind you all that time is what got us into this mess in the first place. This idea of alphanumeric grades was implemented by William Farish in 1792 because there were new government mandated education laws that required students of certain ages to gain an education. Because of this, teachers went from a very small number of students that they were required to assess to a larger and exponentially growing number of students in a very short period of time. And they had to find some way to assess all of these students. And while it seemed like a great system in the beginning, it has actually come to put the efficiency of grading above the quality of feedback we are giving students. Time is what got us into this mess in the first place. That being said, I'm not proposing that this is a meeting that happens one-on-one between each student and each teacher every single week, because I will fully admit that that will take a lot of time. However, what I am saying is that it's going to look different at each school and in each classroom. And it's ultimately going to be up to the administration and that teacher for how this system looks in a classroom. These don't have to be one-on-one meetings. When I was researching this idea, what ultimately came to me as the best idea was maybe the teacher is able to sit down with that student one-on-one at the beginning of the year, get to know the student, figure out what their strengths and their weaknesses are, find out where that student is starting at the beginning of the year and where we want them to be at the end of the year. And then there can be periodic meetings with that teacher and student every grading period, where they can talk about how much they've progressed and where they still need to have room to work. These also don't need to be one-on-one meetings. When I was looking at it, it seemed as if we can start with one-on-one meetings and then move into small groups. Again, this will be up to the teacher's discretion, but this idea of small groups implements a couple of different important things. Encouragement is one of them. As a student, I can tell you that sometimes all you need to know is that you're not alone. Just knowing that someone else has the same weakness as you and is struggling in the same area with you is enough. This can also help with accountability. Being able to hold each other accountable, to remind each other throughout the day that it's not about the grade that you got on that test, that you should not be discouraged, but instead that you've grown so much and progressed so much since the last test. Remind each other to be fostering better study habits and taking better notes in class, participating in class, and actually engaging. I want you all to think back on Susan, the little girl from the beginning who is a not so little girl anymore. She's about to go off to college, go out into the rest of the world and leave the bubble that has been her Christian classical education. Except she doesn't feel prepared. She feels as if the focus of her education up until this point has been on letters and numbers at the top of a piece of paper, instead of how much she has progressed, learned, and grown within her academic endeavors. If we had implemented this system, a more holistic evaluation, goal setting through teacher-led coaching, if we had implemented it into education earlier on, in Susan's pursuit of education? Would she feel more prepared? Would she feel as if she could go off and be prepared for the rest of her life and leave high school? So parents and teachers, I encourage you to look at the way that we are assessing student progress within Christian classical education. I want you to ask yourselves, are we giving our children and our students the best possible education? Or are we letting the efficiency of grading and the issue of time rule our children and students' education? Thank you.
Well done, Amanda. I'll now turn it over to your panel.
Great job, Amanda.
Thank you.
Okay, what do you believe is changing now in our culture that makes this discussion so appropriate and timely?
I think that comparison has been a really big deal in our society. It has come up in many different facets of life, and it's a really big problem, especially I think with kids our age in education. I think that comparison has been really big. I also think that COVID has played a part in this. There are a lot of times where people will be out for different reasons. And so there are people gaining in-class instruction, and there are people getting instruction at home. And being a student who has done both, they are not the same. They are very different. And so I think that that's really played a part in a holistic evaluation, not comparing students and holding them all to the same expectations, because not everyone in the same classroom is getting the same instruction anymore.
Thank you. So Amanda, I want to ask you what your thesis has to do with Ellie Barbers we heard on Monday. And for the sake of everyone who might not have been there, what do you think that students and their parents' definitions of success might determine how they interpret their grades, and how could adding mentor relationships help influence these underlying issues?
I think that I loved Ellie's thesis the other day. It was really incredible. It really helped me look at how we are defining success, and correlated a lot more with my thesis than we knew until a couple of weeks ago. But I think that the way that students and parents are defining success is a lot dependent on the grades that they are getting. I have experienced a lot of my classmates and younger students who their whole focus is getting an A because a lot of the pressure comes from the home. And that's not always the case, but that has played a really big part. There are parents who will say, if you get A's, I will pay you. And that's yet another reward on top of the ones that I mentioned earlier that are playing a really big part in how this looks in the home. Was there a second part to your question?
No,
okay.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi.
It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
I love this idea of coaching. Yeah, it gave me a lot of ideas. I was in your section where you talked about the kinds of goals you might want to set with a student. I noticed that most of what you talked about was still sort of a grades-based goal. Maybe your goal isn't for an A, but it's for a C+, or it's for a B, or I would love to hear if you have some other ideas of goals that might sort of fully address that sort of intellectual, spiritual growth, wisdom and virtue, those kinds of things.
So I thought a lot about this when I was talking about teachers being able to talk with students about their strengths and their weaknesses. I think that while these grades affect all kinds of students, some of the students who get straight A's don't necessarily realize some of their weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And so being able to have those weaknesses in mind when they go off into the rest of the world, mm-hmm. being able to focus on that, because that's going to come up in a job later or something else that they're dealing with in life. And so I think that being aware of those weaknesses and being able to talk with someone about areas that they struggle in can be really important and is less of a grades-based idea.
That's great. I like that. Thinking about the A students too, right? How are they growing? So you've already kind of mentioned comparison, and part of the efficiency of grades, right, is that it is inherently a comparison. It's either comparing you against grade level standards or against other students, right? I would, and you've already kind of addressed this, but I would love to hear you elaborate a little bit more about that small group coaching. How can that move the focus away from competition, where there's winners and losers sort of situation, to a kind of cooperative, this isn't a zero-sum game kind of situation, but we can be working together towards a goal. So I would love to hear more about what that would look like in that kind of small group coaching environment.
So that question actually makes me think about discussions that I've had in my classes, specifically in history, probably in logic school. We talked a lot about why are some governments approached as one person is in charge, and why are some more collaborative environments. And I think that being able to have multiple people with different ideas, everyone's different, so everyone can add something to, we're all struggling in this area, what if we tried this? I think that that can really help the student. I mentioned the encouragement and the holding each other accountability, and I still stand by that. I have experienced at Covenant a lot of my classmates who have struggled in the same way, and just being able to walk in our educational journey together is so helpful. So I think that having other opinions is definitely something that I think would benefit students.
Thank you. So you've doubtless had many opportunities to rub up against this topic in our school, for good or ill, and staying respectful. How might you critique your own experience at our school? And if I can even shove some very specific things that maybe you've encountered. So some of us fractionalize our grades to obfuscate the alphanumeric representation. And we have, had different manifestations of the advisory program that is a small group, sometimes a goal-based structure. And you've seen these things ebb and flow. What might your critique or encouragement be along those lines?
I truthfully think that Covenant has done a very good job at focusing on growth. I think that grades have gotten in the way of that, but everything that Covenant can do, they have done. I think that teachers reminding students of that more often is a very big deal. It has definitely helped in my experience at Covenant, having people there reminding me that it's not about how I perform on things, but it's about the fact that I tried my best and that I'm glorifying God in my endeavors. I also think I will say that the thesis has not been my favorite thing. Dr. Merritt, Mr. Bertram, I love you, but I'm really glad this is almost over. But I think being able to work with Ms. Williams has actually been really helpful, even with just my topic, realizing that I've been able to work closely with someone who has really inspired me on, excuse me, sorry, just my whole topic. Yeah, so I think that being able to work closely with teachers, being able to work closely with Mrs. Williams has really helped me realize how beneficial that can be in other areas of our educational journey.
So give us, was that a B+? Is that? Sorry, I'm just kidding.
Mr. Cook, could you leave the room? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I deserve that. Okay. Just a follow-up on that. Have you found other examples in institutions like ours of how this can be done better? So formal mentoring programs in K-12 schools?
I'm really glad you asked that question. Mrs. Monroy, I got to meet with her. I actually cited her in my paper, so that was cool. But I met with her over Thanksgiving break this past year when I was finding schools who may do a similar idea. and I got to talk to her about what Great Hearts does. And that was cool for me to see a more holistic evaluation in place in an actual school setting. A lot of the books that I read were saying that would be a cool idea, but no, we can't do that. And so that was really cool, really neat to see how they do it. And they, if I remember correctly, that was 6 months ago, but they do written assessments of students. And so when I was talking to Mrs. Monwai, she said it was actually very helpful for the student and the teacher to be able to look at each child individually, each student individually, instead of just generally writing a number on a piece of paper and moving on. And so that was one of the biggest places I saw that implemented in a school, which was very neat.
Amanda, why not do away with alphanumeric grades altogether and just give purely holistic feedback to students? And do you believe, this is the second part of my question, do you believe students will willingly take on or take to this type of change? And then what issues do you foresee that having?
So there are a couple reasons that I decided that alphanumeric grades in conjunction with this holistic evaluation was the best approach. One of which is that America was in a way built off of this system. And so it would be very difficult to just uproot this and what education was built off of and just say, we're not using those anymore. That doesn't work that way. At the same time, I think that they are important. I use the example of colleges and colleges getting students' grades. And I think that there still needs to be some way that the college can compare students. I think that they should not rely solely on those grades. I think that, again, COVID has really messed with the whole admissions processes in college, and my class got to experience that firsthand. But I think that there needs to be some sort of set place where students are able to, where colleges are able to see whether we want that student at our university or not. And so I think it's important that they are still there. They should just not be the focus of education.
Awesome. All right, that being said, do you feel like alphanumeric grades have indiscriminately, do you feel like our current educational system's reliance on alphanumeric grades indirectly discriminates against certain types of students? And then explain that.
Okay, I do think that it affects all students. However, in my experience talking with students in the younger grades, talking with students in grades above me and my classmates, I have seen that if I had to pick out a certain group of students that this affects the most, it would be those with learning disabilities. I think that this idea of comparison, everyone focuses on who's getting straight A's, but that's not a realistic goal for everybody. There are people who, God's given us all different strengths. Not everyone's strengths is academics. Some people are very strong in other areas. A great example of this, any of you who came to see The Hobbit, my little brother was incredible, but I could never do that. And my other brother plays sports in college. I could never do that. There are many examples of this, that people have different strengths. And so we cannot hold everyone to the same expectations. Those people with learning disabilities, we can't hold them to the same getting straight A's reality that some people do have. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to preface this that there's multiple ways you could answer this, so I'm not looking for just one answer. But I like how you talked about how the form of evaluation should fit the aims, right? My question is, how does education uniquely, versus family or church or other things develop virtue in students and help them to glorify God in their lives? What is it that education is doing uniquely? And how could teacher coaching better achieve that specific aim that education helps with?
I think about during my research, I looked a lot at the portrait of a graduate. And one of the biggest things on there is that they love learning. They want students to love learning. And I think that's something that is really big in education that you can't necessarily find in other places. You can foster that in the home, but you can't create it as it's been created in our education system. I think that that is something really big that is first brought up in education at school, but I think it's something that will help students for the rest of their lives. They may not always be in school, but later on down the road, still loving learning is something that can be very beneficial in life and can really help them in a lot of areas.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to open it up to the audience. One question, no follow-up. I'll hold the mic.
Great job, Amanda. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you.
Here's my question. Would you think that this approach would work in, say, a public school as opposed to a Christian classical school?
So I focused on Christian classical education for a couple of reasons. First of which was I didn't think about it at first, and then Mr. Bertram and Dr. Merritt said, you need to narrow that down a little bit. So I did. I think that the biggest reason that I would say it would work a lot better in Christian classical education than it would at a big public school is the class sizes. So teachers now, I'm estimating it's different for each teacher, but we would probably cap our classes to about 22 students, and each teacher probably has 5 of those classes. That's already 110 students that we're expecting these teachers to meet with. And so I think that you run into a lot larger of an issue when you implement this into public schools.
Amanda, great job.
Thank you.
For someone who spends most of my waking hours trying to make classical Christian education work in its ideal form, across the country, it's really exciting to hear you articulate what that ideal should look like. There are obstacles to that ideal that go beyond just a private school's individual choice to implement what you're saying. For example, there's a whole ecosystem of education that's involved and has implications for these kind of decisions. So higher ed, for example, if you eliminate grades and credits and you don't have a transcript, and how you represent a student's ability, impacts their ability to go forward in some type of setting. There are schools who have done this, like Ambleside. They have no numerical grades. They're all reports of progress that don't get numbers or letters, but or at least that the students ever see. They actually do produce one, but the students never see it. And St. John's and Oxford, other places, higher ed, have maintained the tutoring model, but they're very small, and a lot of it's foreign to a lot of families and students, and outside their comfort level. So if you do something like this, it definitely bucks the trend in the infrastructure of education. So did you look at what kind of sacrifices or commitments the school has to make in order to really do this like you're idealizing it to be?
I did not look specifically at that. I did look a lot at the school would have to implement this at a very young age. This is something that we can't just, once students get into high school, say, oh, you don't get grades anymore. That's not going to work that way. They're not going to be used to that if they're used to all of these systems that alphanumeric grades have put into education. And so I think a really big thing is allowing students to get used to this system from a very young age and have the focus be on progress. And I know that that can take a lot of patience for people who teach young ages and already have a lot of patience. But I didn't look specifically at what all this would entail for this school to make this change.
Very nice. So you
you.
acknowledge that Covenant incorporates a lot of the things that you recommend without excluding alphanumeric grading. Is there a upside besides that we work in a culture that demands grades on a transcript, as Mr. Cook alluded to? Is there an upside to having alphanumeric grades, though, independent of the things that you're recommending? For example, if you have students that don't give a flip whether they're here or not, or if you have, so you have the stick and you have the carrot, right? So we recognize that alphanumeric grades provide both. Is there a way to supplant that if you don't have that in a school?
So I have gotten a lot of questions throughout my research on if students focus so much on getting straight A's, how can we expect them to still try in school if they don't have that reward that they're waiting on? And I think that, again, implementing this at a young age can help with that. I think starting that at a young age can help the student with this idea of not being used to grades or the reward. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of the best way to answer your question. Yeah, I think that there are some benefits of the alphanumeric grading system alone. However, at the end of the day, I think that the weaknesses of this system outweigh the strengths of this system.
Great job today, Amanda.
Thank you.
So along those lines, I was thinking, I didn't get to go to a school like Covenant. That's one of the reasons I wanted our kids to come to a place like this for an education like the one you got. But I was thinking about a marquee that was on my high school, my public high school, and it said, "As long as there are tests, there will be prayer in schools." And so along the lines of Dr. Capper's question, would you say that there have been, it sounds like you're saying there probably have been some benefits to you to having alphanumeric grades. So can you think of something like that where there's a character quality in you or some spiritual development that having a big test that you're having to prepare for has aided you or helped in your development?
Yes, I think that, honestly, I think that there are times where I haven't had the alphanumeric grades, and that has taught me more of what how the alphanumeric grades affect us. So instead of, I think you were asking, with those grades, are there times that I have learned how that can be helpful? But there are times where I haven't had it where it's been helpful. There are definitely times, don't want to call my dad out or anything, but there are times where he'll give us a test and it won't have a grade on it. And it has really upset us. I think I speak for almost all 19 of us when I say that, but it's made us focus on how well did we do, what are questions we should be asking, as opposed to what grade did I get? Because most of us will go up to him and ask what grade we got immediately. He doesn't love that. Yes.
Mr. Hoshauer, do you have a question?
Really? Wow. Wow, Mr. Bertram, I thought you loved me. All right.
Well, I found out Thesis wasn't your favorite class, so.
I said I still loved you through it, though.
I just can't help noting my appreciation for your the quality of your title, and I was just curious where you got the inspiration.
For any of you who saw Grace's yesterday, she and I had a similar situation. I was struggling with a title idea, but Dad's creativity wins again.
Amanda, you're finished.
Seniors.